started. First off, I'm just going to say welcome to the Central Ohio Stormwater Roundtable for this year. This is our first one of the year. We'll continue to have these like we were just talking about. We'll be looking at in-person options, probably still keep the virtual outlook to this in some respect. So look forward to those coming up in the year. I want to thank our community partners. They have been really great to us for funding, continued funding over this, pretty tough times we've had, and it helps us bring to you these outreach opportunities throughout the year. So again, thank you very much to our community partners. So here's just a little quick agenda for today. Like I say, I'm Dave Reuter, urban conservationist with Franklin Soil and Water. Your host. I've got Brooke Fresher is also here with Soil and Water. She's kind of manning the chat box and the technical side of this. So if you have questions, feel free to enter those in the chat box. We'll try to get to those if you've got questions and answer some of those, but feel free to use that. And like I say, this is a roundtable. The in-person are nice, but do feel free to speak up and have discussion if you have questions. That's what this is all about, is your participation.
Maybe just do a carry.
Was that comments, or am I hearing somebody else?
I think that was just a little background, so
okay.
I muted somebody.
All right, we'll continue on then. So today we're going to look at just some local wetland resources. Our guest speaker that we have today is Mark Dilley and Mary Skapoff from Mad Scientists and Associates. And we'll be talking about wetlands in general. We kind of kid in the office how we come up with topics, and it's kind of like what grinds your gears this week. Say, darn it, this is always happening, but really, I look at those as educational opportunities. There's, a reason that things are happening. This is where we can do some outreach, talk to people about it. And, this is continuing education. Everybody can learn something new. There's been a lot of changes in the wetland rules recently. We've had, waters of the U.S., definitions have changed. Ohio EPA has made some changes relative to that. And we'll try to talk a bit about that today and have some discussion and questions at the end of today's. Do want to mention some upcoming events. We've got CWP webinars and coalition memberships. Brooke, you want to jump in and talk to that?
Yeah, just to give you guys an update. Oh, and yes, this is being recorded, so we will be sending out a recording after the fact, as well as some certificates for attendance as well. The CWP coalition membership is something we're trying out this year. Last year, CWP was fortunate enough to allow us to do some virtual sharing of their webcast links, and that's not really an option anymore. So we're testing out this coalition membership, and it gives us up to 75 members that we can include at no cost. So what we're doing, we've kind of been building this for our partner communities that have been wanting to participate in the webcasts. I still have some seats available. So if you're interested, just email me or put it in the chat and I will follow up with you. But if you're interested in trying to learn more about what webcasts are available still for the rest of the year, you can go to cwp.org and put it in the chat there. And you can take a look at the webcast that they're offering for 2021 still and kind of get an idea if those topics might be of interest. But like I said, it's a test run for us to see if this is a good option for providing outreach that we would have normally been doing in person together at our office. So Feel free. There's no obligation to you. Make use of whatever member benefits you'd like if you want to sign up to do that, and reach out if you have any questions.
Great, thanks. So that outreach, really, if you want to do that yourself, it's a cost to you. We're providing that to you as members. It's free. It's simple. So I hope you join. Take a look at that. The MS4 permit came out April 1st. If you weren't aware of that, there's education requirements in there for staff. So some of these give you that option to fulfill some of those MS4 permit requirements. Ohio Stormwater Conference, May 20 through 21st. That's coming up. I will be there. It's a hybrid event, so you can either stay home or you can go to the Kalahari and join in the festivities. They've still got, I believe they said they have 500 exhibitors there. So the exhibition hall will be full, and hopefully we'll have some folks there to look at that stuff and participate in that. The MS4 boot camp is always a part of that prior to the Ohio Stormwater Conference. Sign up for that as well through the conference website. That will be May 19th, and it's a really good event if you have people that need MS4 training. If you want the latest and greatest, EPA is usually there to answer questions. So I encourage you to take a look at the boot camp. Other thing I want to mention is Ohio Stormwater Awareness Week, October 17th through the 23rd. This is a regional event, again, kind of aimed at that MS4 requirements for your pipe programs, so that you're getting that public involvement and public education out of the way. It's real easy to do. There's a toolkit on the website, has things like press releases, videos, resolutions that you can pass in your municipality, that sort of thing that you can do to outreach your community. So take a look at that if you're interested. I hope you participate. So let's talk a little bit about wetlands and the importance of wetlands and what wetlands are, and how do we regulate them. When I think of wetlands in Ohio, I kind of take a deep dive and look at the deep ecology of what's here and why it's here. And these two critters here probably, to me, represent the best examples of what that deep ecology that has occurred in Ohio is a result of, or what's resulting in those faunal compositions. Freshwater mussels, we are a center of diversity when it comes to freshwater mussels. We have Big Darby, Little Darby, chock full of species of freshwater mussels, and it's a fairly small drainage. You look at salamanders, we have a plethora of species of salamanders, all sorts, river species, more isolated wetland type species. But if you take those two together and you look at the reason that they're around is, it's water quality, and it's a base flow in the streams. You have a hydrology that's stable. If you look at Ohio pre-settlement, we're talking about the Great Eastern deciduous forests. You had vernal pools within there. You had groundwater recharge that was adding that base flow to our streams and maintaining a stable hydrology. That's the essence of what the ecology was in Ohio. So now I've used this figure before, looks at Ohio water budget, and you can see that 2/3 of our water budget deals with the groundwater. it soaks in, it gets returned to the atmosphere through the evapotranspiration of plants. So 2/3 of that volume is taken up either in wetlands or groundwater interactions or interception by plants and trees. It's a big percentage of what our hydrology is. When we develop land, what happens? We pave over that. You make those impervious surfaces. And where does that 2/3 of our hydrology have to go? It either adds to the runoff, or we do our conventional stormwater and create detention ponds. And I guess something I would argue is that, we're really comparing apples and oranges. Our conventional stormwater detention is dealing with surface water. What we're looking at in the hydrology is groundwater related. So we're not really addressing stormwater and runoff the way we should. Let's just take a look. I'm going to kind of just run through an example of when we look at wetlands here, especially in Franklin County. I don't have the pleasure of looking at Category 3 forested, beautiful wetlands. They're just, we're on this urban interface that they're very lacking, especially if they come under development. So what are we left with? Well, chances are it's farmed wetlands, or it's old vernal pools that have been forested, and logged and converted into agricultural fields. So this is kind of my favorite area. Here's out in Brown Township. This is Darby Plains area, big ag field under current agricultural production. Got CAUV on it. It's a farm. So when this comes under development pressure, though, you got that change in land use. And what that means is you're no longer going to be in agricultural production. It's going to be residential, commercial, what have you. So what do? We review a lot of proposals in Franklin County. And when we get, wetland proposals, wetland delineations, wetland reports, things of that nature, we look for specific things in there that are going to tell us, has the due diligence been done on that site? And, right now I'll say, we are not a regulatory agency. We are simply looking for that due diligence. So what does that mean, and what are we looking for? What types of things are we looking for? So again, here's this farm field here. Let's say it's going to come under development pressure. First thing is hydric soils. What does that mean? What is that exactly? There used to be a national list of hydric soils, named hydric soils. That was part of the checklist that you went through when you did delineations. Is it a hydric soil? They've changed that up. That was a little problematic because there were hydric inclusions in a lot of these soils. So now soils are looked at like they're all hydric, but they have a certain percentage of hydric inclusions to them. So this is our in-house GIS information that we have. It is available to the public. We have, I'm told, a public map source now. I think it's a draft version. I'm not sure if it's available yet, but it'll contain all this type of information that you're welcome to use when you assess a site too. So hydric soils, here's just kind of a color ramp of hydric inclusions. You see down in the here would be a Lewisburg soil, kind of a knoll area, upland area. These are likely Crosby soils in through here, which are the sloped soils. And then you have the Kokomo soils, which you can see here throughout this site. Very large areas of Kokomo. And this is pretty indicative of Brown and Prairie Township, west side of town. very flat till plains. You have very little elevational change, and you've got these deep pockets of Kokomo soils that have formed in those locations. And, you know, typically you look pre-settlement times at these, those would be wet forests or probably tall grass prairie out in the Darby Plains area. You know, this Lewisburg knoll here, you know, you might have seen a bur oak on there, you know, surrounded by tall grass prairie throughout this entire area. Very wet, saturated soils, so it makes it great farmland out there. It's very hard to drop below the wilting point for plants, so it's very drought tolerant out there. Makes great farmland. Take it a little further. Here's NWI wetlands. We don't rely too much on the NWI wetlands. It's good background information, but historically something was identified on this site that shows there was an NWI wetland out there. Doesn't line up exactly with the hydric soils. You know, I'm not sure what the shape is. You can look back through historic aerials and see some wet spots there, as well as a lot of the other site as well. So looking at those NWI wetland maps is an important part of this. We have a Franklin County Historic Wetlands map. This is based on 30-meter Landsat imaging, so that's why you see that square right in the middle there. But again, something was identified in that field prior to this in some form or fashion. So that indication that there may be wetlands on the site, you know, is there. And that's where we would look for that due diligence that, you know, you don't get a submittal that just says, oh, the field's in ag, you know, there's no vegetation and it doesn't meet the criteria. It's like, well, you know, we've got some indication that does, and perhaps we need to look at an atypical situation for this delineation because the vegetation is gone, because of the agriculture. This is that, again, that change in land use that triggers a different scenario in the delineation. Farmed wetlands are fine. They're protected by the Food Security Act, and they can farm wetlands all they want. But when that land use changes, we're talking about a different type of delineation at this point. And then combined with the contours, you can see the depressional areas. There's certainly a lot of wet hydric soils on this site, and it's going to be a consideration in the long term, depending on what type of development happens on the site. So that would be kind of just a typical analysis of what happens on a site. You know, where we might ask for, you know, this is going to require a delineation. Like I say, we're not the final arbiters on this. This is U.S. Army Corps and Ohio EPA that's going to make that final decision on that. We're just doing the technical checks that make sure the proper documentation has occurred. So if you look at that, you know, now think about that back to what I was saying on the groundwater interaction. The site, you know, vast majority of that is hydric soils. That's a big, vast sponge there that is holding water, contributing through the ground flow to our streams, and really providing that base flow to streams and that desynchronization of flood events. You know, when we don't have that and change that into stormwater, this is what you get. You get that urban stream syndrome, the downcutting of channels, the head cuts on ephemeral streams, because we've changed that groundwater situation into a surface water. Remember, all those stormwater ponds that we put in have to have that volume returned within 72 hours. So there's this base discharge that occurs in a short order relative to groundwater that causes this reaction that you see in our streams. I always like to say, a lot of things changes, but some things never do. So wetland delineation manuals with the Corps, we're back to the 87 manual. I was doing delineations in Florida under this manual. We're still using it. I actually work with the National Research Council on developing the 89 manual on wetland delineation. That one was thrown out and we're back to the 87. We've had another recent round with a manual to come out, and that one was thrown out as well. So we're still using the 1987 Corps manual for delineations. The old joke back then was, if you can float your canoe in it, it's Corps jurisdiction, and kind of frankly, that still holds true. If you can take a boat down it, and it stems historically from the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. You had fur trappers and things of that rudimentary nature that were doing interstate travel with goods and supplies that needed to be transferred. So it's we're kind of in the same boat now as far as what the WOTUS rules are saying as far as wetland delineations go. And I'll let Mary speak to that in a little bit in her presentation. They do have the regional supplements now. This actually comes from the Sacramento. This is a PDF that I'll share the link to you for. But we have these regional delineation guidance. We have the Midwest region, which does talk more about vernal pools. And if you're in a situation where you have a site with vernal pools potential, be sure that this regional supplement is being used as well. But it still goes to drawing a line in the sand, basically. When we do look at delineations, we're saying one side's a wetland and one side's a non-wetland. What about setbacks? When we do an ORAM of a wetland, one of the criteria is how much buffer is there. Well, that buffer is all on the other side of the line, so you could actually impact the wetland and not touch the buffer, or touch the buffer anyway, regardless of not impacting the wetland. And you're degrading the wetland, however, you didn't impact the wetland. So we're still looking at this from a point, a line. And I've always contended, this is where I'll get on my soapbox and say, we really need to look at the environmental services that are being provided by these wetlands. It's that buffer, it's that setback that is helping with the health and the state of that wetland that's there. And those setbacks are really going to come down to the local entities, having the political will to enforce those setbacks and those buffer areas. There's guidance on buffers. The rainwater manual has guidance in there for category 1, 2, and 3 wetlands, but having that established wetland buffer maintained is a very hard thing to do, and you won't see that when you get a core jurisdiction. You won't see that from an EPA jurisdiction as well. So something to think about from that respect. This is the link. I think Brooke put this in the chat box for the core wetland delineations. It's a pretty good PDF. Give you an idea of what the Corps looks at when they do delineations, and I recommend it if you're not familiar with that. I threw this in here. This was an article in Nature just this month about soil moisture driving carbon uptake. There's been some back and forth on what role the soil carbon and moisture content, how that's driven, you know, whether it's atmospheric, you know, or based in the soils. It's a very interesting article, but I put this in here only to point out, you know, when we're looking at those large hydric soil areas, this is a function of those areas that is critically important to what we do. You know, that soil carbon, when it dries out, when soil's dry, that carbon's released. Wetter soils are going to sequester more carbon, and this is going to become a big thing in the future, especially when we're looking at industries that have to reduce their carbon footprint. You know, where are they going to go? How are they going to do it? You know, this is where we're looking at banking carbon, doing carbon uptake projects. It's a very cheap way of achieving that relative to trying to pull CO2 out of the air and sequestering it that way. Another item I just saw this morning, actually, CFAS with OSU is doing this slowing climate change rooted in trees. You can register for a webinar that's upcoming. I don't have the date for that exactly, but again, there's the link for that you might want to check out and look at the potential of trees on just that, you know, that banking of soil carbon, banking of carbon in trees aspect. So again, how can we do things? Green infrastructure, you know, this is what we're talking about is applying green infrastructure practices to development, you know, low impact development. What are those best management practices? But it's, you know, it comes down to really emulating natural hydrology. That's how we're going to get there. And part of that is looking at these large areas, preserving our wetlands, creating more wetlands if we can, you know, but that preservation of our existing wetlands, and particularly the functions, is what we really need to focus on, and how we can protect those functions. You know, just a few examples. It's a very simple pavement disconnects for stormwater, you know, infiltrating areas. It's very easily accomplished in a lot of sites, but we just have to plan ahead for that kind of thing and allow for that. Another example, just infill of you know, your parking islands. These tree islands really serve no other purpose than to plant a tree and get landscape credit. Why not, you know, double duty them up, add some stormwater function and values to it, little evapotranspiration, little soil carbon sequestration. Very simple things to do. Green roofs, you know, again, a lot of this is you know, small in numbers when we're looking at volume control, but that's not the big takeaway here. It's really getting that plant aspect into it, getting that evapotranspiration and getting contact with the soils that we have already. I think that's about all I have to say. Brooke, do we have any?
No, I haven't had any chat questions come in.
Any chat questions? Okay.
No, but if anybody, you know, feel free to unmute yourself as well if anybody has a question as we get ready to move in.
I'll give it a moment, and I will say welcome to Mark Dilly. He is the owner and operator of Mad Scientist, and I believe you're the sitting president of Ohio Wetlands Association, are you not?
That is correct.
Yeah, so we have a good ally in Mark. I appreciate you wanting to help us out today. I will turn it over to you. We also have Mary Scapoff with Mad Scientists. She is your permit specialist, I
Yes.
I see. Okay. She'll be presenting, I think, after Mark, but Mark, go ahead and I will stop my sharing here.
All right.
And you can take it away when you're ready.
Okay, hold on a second here. There we go. All right, let's see if this works. All right, you seeing my starter slide there?
There we go.
Yep, looks good.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, David, for the introduction. Since you mentioned my role with the Ohio Wetlands Association, I did want to put in a plug for the OWA. If any of you are interested in wetlands, current news in the world of wetlands, what's happening around the state, I encourage you to become a member. You can find more information at www.ohwetlands.org. In my short intro presentation today, I'm going to provide an overview of wetland history and the benefits of wetlands, which I hope will provide everyone with a better understanding of the importance of the regulations that Mary will discuss next. So many may not realize it, but Ohio was a relatively wetland-rich state pre-settlement. Before European settlement, over 17% of our state's land was wetland. Almost 60% of this estimated 5 million acres was in the Great Black Swamp in northwestern Ohio. And most of this swamp and other wetlands were lost through human activities, including draining and filling, as well as development that followed. As a result, Ohio now has less than an estimated 10% of its original wetlands. The Great Black Swamp bore the brunt of these losses, being reduced in area by 99.4%. It's a staggering figure. To put these losses in perspective, I'll lead by saying that we're number 2 in the nation with greater than 90% loss of wetlands. Nothing that we specifically want to brag about because it's come with a cost. Only California has a higher percentage of loss from their original wetland resources. Global estimates are that wetlands cover 5 to 8% of the Earth's land surface. And with only 1.7% of its land area consisting of wetlands, Ohio now has far less than this estimated global average. So why do we care? What effects have these losses had? Well, on the upside, the alternate land uses have provided prosperity. But this has come at a significant cost that we've only begun to fully realize in the last half century. Declining waterfowl populations in the mid-20th century were the first red flag that was picked up on by the conservation community that our treatment of wetlands was having unintended consequences. And now increased flooding and harmful algal blooms are our next wake-up call. These are all concerns for our soil and water conservation community. Wetlands offer many benefits, which can be described as ecosystem services. There was a report put out by the United Nations called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was released in 2003, and it organized these ecosystem services into 3 major categories. Provisioning services, which meet specific material needs for humans. Regulating services, that are those services that generally operate in the background and where the benefits are noteworthy and often measurable, but more indirect. And finally, cultural services, which are a bit more esoteric. These are often overlooked, but are gaining attention, particularly during these challenging times as people look to reconnect with nature. When I ask people what they think wetlands are good for, they often first mention their value as wildlife habitat. This ecosystem service could be argued to fit under any of the ecosystem services groupings I mentioned, but wherever you place it, it is important. In fact, wetlands are integral to the life cycles of many wildlife species, and as such, their dramatic disappearance from major portions of our landscape have adversely affected wildlife. This table shows the percent of threatened and endangered species that rely on wetlands during at least part of their life history. And you can see from this that wetlands are particularly critical to the continued existence of many birds, reptiles, amphibians, mussels, and fish species, just as David alluded to previously. There are a couple key points I'd like to emphasize regarding wetlands and their role in the landscape. First, all wetlands provide benefits, but they're not all the same, and they offer ecosystem services at differing levels depending on a number of key variables, such as their type, size, drainage area, and location. Also, the regulating services that wetlands offer are highly related and interdependent. In the context of today's soil and water conservation oriented discussion, it is these vital regulating services that are my focus. It all relates to allowing the land to capture, store, cleanse, infiltrate, and evapotranspirate water as nature intended. Let's look at some similarities between flood control and water quality in relation to wetlands. You can think of this table as sort of a Mad Lib, filling in the blanks with the information provided in the two columns here. We can see that wetlands provide flood control by capturing runoff and slowly releasing it to streams. This reduces erosion and improves water quality. To the contrary, the loss of wetlands accelerates these discharge rates. For example, prior to European settlement, the bottomland hardwood forests along the Mississippi River were estimated to have had this capacity to store 60 days of stormwater. Now they only have the capacity to store 12 days. So it's all connected. These two hydrographs may be familiar to many of you. The lines represent discharge or flow volume over time for two different scenarios. The blue line represents a stream in a watershed with abundant wetlands and natural vegetative cover. In this scenario, we have natural protection against erosion, nutrient loading, flooding, and the resulting harmful algal blooms. And we have streams that have better sustained base flow because the water is gradually recharging, the water that collects in the wetlands is gradually recharging the water table, which then slowly and steadily releases to streams, maintaining that base flow, very important base flow for the aquatic community. The red line represents a stream in a watershed that has lost many wetlands and is experiencing what is commonly referred to as hardening of the watershed. This results in increased erosion, nutrient loading, flooding, and harmful algal blooms. And a flashy hydrology where streams tend to crest and fall very dramatically. The whole process is very exaggerated. And because the groundwater isn't being recharged through wetlands, once the storm has passed, the stream itself, the levels drop very quickly and don't have that sustained base flow necessary to sustain the aquatic community. So that's a very important point in all of this. So the area between these curves are what I might refer to as the land of the lost opportunities. In this area, we're talking about the loss of flood control and water quality improvement. And here we're talking about the loss of groundwater recharge and stream health. So how can we shift back to a state of improved watershed function to reacquire these regulating services and return to a condition more like scenario 1? As much as I hate to use the phrase, we need to flatten the curve. And that's why we have stormwater regulations. That's why we we're making efforts to intercept and decommission drain tiles and reduce impervious surfaces, and certainly preserving and restoring wetlands, all functions that are benefited by strong regulations and incentive programs that will help us get there in terms of flattening this curve. In my final slide, I just want to share some general characteristics of wetlands and where they occur. First, we can talk about water sources. The water sources to wetlands are an important characteristic. Some wetlands, such as bogs, and I'll mention as I'm clicking through this, you'll see little stars light up on my cartoonish watershed map, indicating those features that I'm highlighting. Bogs get their water almost exclusively from precipitation, while other systems like fens receive steady groundwater flow from seeps, which dominate their hydrology. The vast majority of wetlands, however, receive water from multiple sources. They, of course, get the direct precipitation, but also may receive overland runoff, overbank flooding, groundwater influences, etc. The plant communities are also important. In this graphic, I've represented herbaceous wetlands, which can be marshes, aquatic beds with floating vegetation, wet meadows that are generally a little on the drier side of the wetland spectrum, scrub shrub wetlands such as buttonbush swamps, and forested wetlands represented by bottomland floodplain areas and swamps. And then finally, I want to mention isolation status. This describes whether a wetland has a surface connection to other surface waters. An isolated wetland, represented in the areas shown with the blue stars here, are those that are separate and distinct, where water can collect in a closed depression, but these features don't tend to overflow into our rivers and streams. They really are points of groundwater recharge and infiltration predominantly. Bogs and vernal pools are good representatives of these types of isolated wetlands. Everything else, fens, marshes, floodplains, represent what we consider to be non-isolated or jurisdictional wetlands that do possess a discernible surface water connection, at least during certain times of the year. And Mary will be elaborating on these terms and the implications in the regulatory context here coming up next. I want to say it's important to understand that both isolated and non-isolated wetlands and all of the community types that we see in wetlands, all of those wetlands are important in storing and slowly releasing water, providing water quality benefits, and many of the other ecosystem services that I touched on earlier. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mary to talk a little bit about the regulations.
Hey, thank you.
Let's see here. I got to get back to my full screen here. I can't get this window to enlarge. Oh, here we go. Sorry. There we go. I am no longer sharing, Mary.
Okay. Hopefully I am. Go ahead and I don't know if you guys can actually see it now. It doesn't seem to be.
Yeah, we're not seeing anything yet, Mary.
Uh-oh. Go figure.
Yeah. It's those ghosts in the machine
Okay,
again.
Desktop one.
Do you still see you have the sharing screen option down there, Mary? Or is it?
And it's now saying open system preferences. So just gonna check.
Oh, Mary's working on that. If there were any questions on anything I presented, I'm certainly willing to.
Yeah, good
answer
time
those.
now. If anybody does have some questions, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in if you like.
Mary, if you need to, I can definitely pull up your PowerPoint on my end and try to screen share it.
Yeah, let's do that, because I think with this, it's something with my security preferences on
Okay.
Mac. So let's, instead of wasting any time, if that's easier, let's just do that.
I will go ahead and do that.
Good thing we have backups.
Yep.
Thank you.
No problem. Let's see if I get the right one here.
Yep, that is it.
Right.
So,
All right.
I think the only thing is I may have to give you a signal to click through.
Right. That's
So
okay.
maybe I'll just give you a little thumbs up. Yeah, thank you, Mark. My name's Mary, and I am the permitting specialist here at MAD. Essentially, my role is to serve as a liaison between our clients and the regulatory agencies, whether that be the state regulatory agency or agencies, and also the federal regulatory agencies as well. So just a little background. This is, I actually made this presentation a number of years ago, back when I thought regulatory compliance was complicated. And now it's gotten even crazier. So it's changing on a daily basis at this point, whereas you could really try to memorize some of the rules and they would be good for a couple years at least. Now it's, newsworthy, I should say. And one of the main reasons for that is because there's actually no specific wetland law in the US. And you may think, well, wait a second, there are laws in the US that cover wetland regulations. Isn't that part of the Clean Water Act? But when the Clean Water Act was enacted in the early 1970s, the intent of that was really to cover the more navigable waters and waters that were very obviously polluted. The wetland regs have been, since piecemealed and tributary regulations as well into environmental regulations, where we've taken the language that's already in place under the Clean Water Act and tried to incorporate these other waters. And that's why we're left with this cycle of kind of ever-changing regulations, because they can be left up to interpretation and oftentimes taken to both state courts and federal courts as well. And they can be left up to changes with the political atmosphere as well. So I'll skip through some of these, Brooke, because I know Mark kind of mentioned them. So this is just a slide that shows who I primarily deal with. I'm going to go over, I know this isn't the most dynamic of topics, but I'm really going to try to highlight some major changes that have happened recently. And it's strangely enough, these changes have happened both on the federal level and also on the state level as well. So it's a really dynamic time for permitting. But primarily when I work with the federal agencies, we hear a lot about the US EPA, but I rarely deal with US EPA for permitting. They have a say in the regulations, obviously, but the regulatory authority that I deal with probably on a day-to-day basis is the Army Corps of Engineers. So they're the ones that we will actually submit a permit to. And they are the ones who will review the permit application, do state coordination, interagency coordination, and follow up with that permit as well. So these are the core district offices located within the state of Ohio. You can see the northern part of the state is the Buffalo office in New York. But the majority of the state is the Huntington district office, which is out of West Virginia, and then like a small little sliver in the east, which is the Pittsburgh office. I really deal with Huntington probably the most, just because they're, the location of our office and where a lot of our projects are situated. So as we mentioned earlier, and I mentioned earlier in the presentation as well, a lot of our wetland regulations, well, all of our wetland regulations have really stemmed from the Clean Water Act, which was originally known as the Federal Water Pollution Control Act from 1972. And the goal of that program originally was to kind of take a step back, look at projects and see if there were opportunities to avoid impacts to waters of the US or federally protected waters. If those impacts can't be avoided, if we can minimize those impacts, and then if minimization, if we've gone as far as we can with minimization, what can we do to offset or mitigate those impacts? And again, the Clean Water Act was really enacted out of a very obvious and visible need to help control pollution throughout the US in our very obvious waterways. So we've probably seen this picture before, or others like it. This is the Cuyahoga River, which was literally the catalyst to start regulating these navigable waters. And since then, now we're dealing with wetlands, ephemeral streams, features that maybe go a little more unnoticed because we don't necessarily see the benefits and the pollution that might be affecting these smaller waterways. But this, obviously, a river being, getting caught on fire due to the abundance of pollution, it can pretty well be agreed upon across political lines that we need to do something to regulate the pollution going into these waters. So that was really what initiated these policies. So again, these are navigable waters, and I'll kind of skip through a lot of these, Brooke, because I'm going to focus on I'm going to focus on a lot of the features that have been highly we can stop here, highly debatable regulated features. So you may have heard this year has been a whirlwind for federal regs. Back in June of 2020, under the Trump administration, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule was finalized. And that rule really narrowed the definition of what would be considered a federally protected water. Now I say this today, we're just kind of taking a snapshot of what's happening at this very moment, but this could very well change in the upcoming months. We do have a new administration that is actually currently reviewing the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So it could be something that goes into the court system, both on a state and federal level. So there could be more to come with this. But as of today, it is in place, and the Corps, the federal agency, is abiding by that current Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So the big ticket item here, if you're kind of falling asleep because regulations are not the most exciting topic and you're suddenly waking up, the big thing you need to take notes on and kind of highlight and circle and do whatever you need to remember this part is that ephemeral streams are no longer under federal jurisdiction. So these are the features that really we see this time of year of flowing that are impacted by the spring rainfall and also spring snowmelt, hence the term ephemeral, because we really see them active during the spring. They are well known from an ecological standpoint as nurseries, essentially for macroinvertebrate species. And they were regulated previously to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule more on a case-by-case basis. Tributaries were originally considered tributaries or federally protected if they had a defined bed and bank and an ordinary high water mark. This is no longer the case. So when we're out doing delineations, those two components are not jurisdictional factors when we're taking a look at a tributary. The main component now of a federally regulated tributary is continuous flow. So intermittent streams and perennial streams are still considered federally protected waters of the US. However, ephemeral streams are not. Now, that does not mean in the state of Ohio, if we were to impact these areas, you're good to go, because the state of Ohio has actually lumped in the protection of ephemeral streams under their isolated wetland general permit. So they still require a permit. You just have to only deal with Ohio EPA at that point. So click, we can keep clicking. This is another key component, and you could stay right there, Brooke. Adjacent waters have also, the definition of those features has also been modified under this Navigable Waters Protection Rule. In the past, we used, when we were out in the field and writing our delineation reports, we used what was called the significant nexus test. And in some cases, distance parameters to see if a water that was kind of questionable, whether or not it was considered jurisdictional, if it had, that hydrologic connection to a water of the state, if it was kind of on the fence, if we could argue that the waterways could affect the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of that feature, they were kind of connected in those ways, then we could argue there was a significant nexus and that water would be considered, or that wetland would be considered jurisdictional. At this point, the significant nexus test is no longer used under federal regulations. Now the features actually have to be physically touching one another to be considered jurisdictional, or they can be separated by a man-made berm. You can assume if that berm were to be taken away, that they would have that hydrologic connection, or if they're connected by a culvert, that would be a physical feature that connects the two features. Okay. And then I mentioned earlier, Ohio Environmental Protection Agency is our state regulatory authority, and they have now taken jurisdiction over those features that would otherwise not be regulated by the Corps of Engineers. So they have the authority granted to them under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act. So if we even apply for a permit just with the Corps of Engineers, we still have to have some type of coordination with the state agencies, and that may be through state-specific standards that Ohio EPA has enacted. And sometimes the Corps will actually coordinate on behalf of the permittee or the applicant to coordinate with the state to see if the project meets those state-specific standards. And then when we're not dealing specifically with the Corps, for working under with isolated, I use the word isolated, but under it gets kind of tricky because the federal government considers features that are what we would consider isolated. They call them non-jurisdictional, but the state actually still calls them isolated. So it gets kind of tricky because one authority has a label for them and the other does not. So if we are dealing with non-jurisdictional features, typically those would then fall under state jurisdiction. And we can actually go through this one. So this is new as of 2017, which seems like ages and ages ago. But as I mentioned, when we do apply for a permit with the Corps of Engineers, there are these state-specific parameters that do really impact our ephemeral stream features, because Ohio EPA has enacted what's called the stream eligibility map. So whenever I get a project that is going to potentially impact a stream, whether it be ephemeral, perennial, or intermittent, the first thing I do is I will look up that project's location on Ohio EPA's stream eligibility map. And it's actually on the next slide here. It's not the greatest image of it, but this is just an area near our office in central Ohio. You can kind of see this lovely rainbow of colors, but what this means is that Ohio EPA, separate from the Corps of Engineers, took a look through GIS mapping, through aerial mapping, from some field survey work at areas in the state of Ohio, and designated certain watersheds or certain areas as what they consider ineligible for a blanket 401. You might be thinking, what the heck does that mean? But that really means that if you have a project in one of these lovely purple areas, and that project is impacting a stream that is a stream in the eyes of the Corps of Engineers, you will likely have to do additional paperwork and additional permitting through Ohio EPA, because Ohio EPA considers these areas to harbor more ecologically valuable stream resources. If it's in a yellow area, that means you probably have to do additional field work to determine the quality of the stream. And if it's in a no color area, that means you could apply for a permit with the Corps of Engineers, and they're going to be the regulatory agency that you work with, assuming you meet all of the other state conditions, and you really won't have to coordinate with Ohio EPA as much. So this was enacted before ephemeral streams were removed from federal protection. It's become even more of a critical source at this point, because those features that are no longer captured by federal jurisdiction, by the Corps of Engineers, are now even more abundantly visible under state jurisdiction here. So again, the Ohio EPA has state regulatory authority to protect these features. Vernal pools are one example of isolated or non-jurisdictional features, ephemeral streams, and you can apply for general permits that are pretty much the same permitting timeline. At this point, maybe even a little less costly when you're doing any type of impact to those features, assuming they fall under a certain threshold of impacts. Now, one thing I actually added to my presentation, which was a little newsflash bulletin on this specific screen, was the fact that that authority that Ohio EPA has over ephemeral streams is currently being contested in the State House of Representatives. A new bill has been introduced to the State House as of, I believe it was as of last week. So it is a very, very recent development where the push is now to remove ephemeral streams from even state jurisdiction, so that we would go back to just state isolated wetland permits, and ephemeral features would not be regulated in the state of Ohio. So that is a very, very recent proposed change. It has not been finalized. Again, this was introduced. And at the very last slide, I'll kind of say what the lay citizen could do if you're interested in learning more about that. And so I keep saying, and here's another change, because it really has been quite frequent. So from a federal standpoint, we actually had a slew of new nationwide permits, so new general permits that were enacted over the winter this past year in 2021. And these impact both state jurisdiction and federal jurisdiction, even though they're even though they are federal permits. And I'll kind of discuss what that means for Ohio EPA, or where Ohio EPA's role fits into all this. But the biggest part of all of this is that there were 16 permits that were either issued brand new or modified as part of this rollout in 2021. And this happened rather quickly. The other permits that were in place, they go on a 5-year permitting cycle. So they were set to expire in 2022. And you're thinking, wait a second, why are we getting new permits now? This is a little early. And why aren't all of them included in this rollout? And that's kind of the question of the hour here. We have a slew of permits that aren't included in this modification, that are on a different expiration timeline, that are set to expire next year. And we have a slew of permits that have been newly issued. So on the next couple of slides, I'll kind of tell you what that means. Ohio EPA was informed of these changes. And as I mentioned before, Ohio EPA still has state-specific standards that are linked to these federal permits. So even if you're thinking, okay, well, I'm just working with the Corps of Engineers, there's kind of fine print underneath each one of the permits that states that you have to meet these state-specific standards, including checking the impacts on the stream eligibility map as well. If you're impacting streams, it doesn't apply if you're impacting wetland areas. But Ohio EPA is actually still in discussion with the Corps on how their state-specific standards fall into play with these new and modified nationwide permits. So we have 16 nationwide permits that are kind of up in the air with how Ohio EPA fits into this. Do we have to even notify the Ohio EPA at this point? I would advise my clients, yes, even under these new permits, but there could be a lot of projects that kind of go under the radar because again, this hasn't really been finalized from the state standpoint. And one of the, again, if you're kind of dozing off because it's regulatory compliance and you've highlighted your ephemeral stream note, here's the other part you really need to highlight. One of the major changes that's come into play with these modifications to the nationwide permits is originally there was a stream impact threshold for most nationwide permits of 300 linear feet of stream bed. So if you had if you were impacting less than 300 linear feet of stream, then you could qualify for one of these general nationwide permits. If you go above that, that doesn't mean you can't do your project. It just simply means you have to apply for what's called an individual permit, which is a lengthier permitting process, and it costs a lot more money. For wetlands, that limit was a 1/2 acre. And that's still in play. That 1/2 acre threshold is still in play. However, the Corps said, well, let's just make this consistent and have everything be a 1/2 acre threshold, which, you know, at first you think, okay, consistency is good. That makes a lot of sense. But streams are measured from, they're a linear feature. So it's kind of hard to use that parameter, the 1/2 acre or the acreage parameter for measurements when you're looking at a stream. So the thought is this could actually allow for much larger impacts to smaller stream channels. Again, we're hoping that the stream eligibility map will kind of capture some of these features that would otherwise be lost, but that's not guaranteed. And of course, that's not guaranteed in other states as well. So that 1/2 acre limit makes it a little tricky to determine your impact thresholds. We can go through this one. That just lists the permits that are modified. The other big change that happened with this rollout was a 1-to-1 mitigation ratio was established for stream bed losses over 0.03 acres. And Ohio EPA in their draft rules, they require that mitigation regardless of even if you fall under what's considered a non-reporting permit with the Corps of Engineers. So there are some permits that you can follow the terms and conditions with the Corps, and you don't necessarily have to submit additional paperwork and you think, oh, I'm good to go. But regardless, if you're over that 0.03 acre threshold, you still have to purchase mitigation credits through a mitigation bank, a state-approved mitigation bank, and provide proof of those mitigation credits to Ohio EPA. Other regulatory provisions to be mindful of, especially if you're not in the wetland biz, or if you're just learning the basics of permitting. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is, of course, a federal agency, but they also have to have coordination with the Corps of Engineers when we do apply for a federal permit. It's called interagency coordination, and it's under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. And so that essentially says that once we submit a permit to the Corps, this is not with the state. So if you're applying for a state isolated wetland or ephemeral stream permit, this coordination does not apply. But if you're applying for a federal permit, federal, you have to coordinate in some way to ensure that you are not jeopardizing threatened or endangered species as part of your project work. Now, from a practical standpoint, that might mean if you're doing in-stream work, you might have to do additional surveying of mussel species. The big one for a lot of our projects is abiding by tree clearing restrictions. So that would mean that a project would have to remove trees if tree removal is a requirement. They would need to do so during the winter months when it's the off-season or non-breeding season for Indiana and northern long-eared bats. So that just discusses the tree clearing season. A lot of these trees that we look at are the shagbark hickory trees. However, that rule has actually been modified over some time, where I usually say if you're doing any type of tree removal on the property and you're not removing itty bitty baby trees, then you're likely going to have to abide by tree clearing restrictions if you're getting a federal permit with the Corps for wetland or stream impacts. The rule is trees greater than 3 dBH, which is, it's pretty tiny, regardless of if they have peely bark or cavities, or if they are dead or alive. You still will likely have to abide by tree clearing restrictions, which are written into the permits. So, and there, every now and then when we're doing a site assessment, there's other threatened or endangered species that will pop up. And that's all kind of part of our search when we do delineations and we coordinate with both ODNR and Fish and Wildlife Service. So what can you do if you are not a permitting person and you are just kind of learning a little bit here and there about wetland regulations, or even if you're just a concerned citizen? What a lot of the catalysts are for, coordinating with Ohio EPA or the Corps coming out to various sites are concerned citizens. I get a lot of calls from clients that say, we have an EPA inspector coming out, but we don't think we're doing anything wrong. And I'll say, do you have a neighbor that maybe saw you guys doing something that you weren't supposed to be doing? They'll say, oh, yeah, we had some silt fence down, or, we did do our tree clearing outside of the window. And usually it's a neighbor that calls, and Ohio EPA has to follow up on those citizen concerns. Ohio EPA and the Corps are pretty short staffed, so they're not going to inspect every single site out there. So they really rely on citizens to take a look at these sites and let them know if they believe there's any type of issue. Sometimes it's minor, and somebody might just be unhappy that a project is going in next to their site, and regardless of if the developer is abiding by all the rules. But in some instances, there actually are cases where rules are not being followed appropriately. It happens a lot with stormwater management plans and SWIP plans, where BMPs are supposed to be in place and they just weren't installed properly, or they're failing. It happens a lot with tree removal projects as well, where somebody will go out and start clear cutting a site, and they had a federal permit but just didn't abide by the tree clearing restrictions. So saying something, if you feel like something quite isn't right on a project, these are just the district offices that you can call. It usually goes a little bit further when you call Ohio EPA. You can call the Corps of Engineers, but again, their district offices they're further from a lot of our project sites. So Ohio EPA is usually the first source that I advise a citizen to reach out to. And if it is a project that isn't even under Ohio EPA's jurisdiction, they'll refer you to the right Corps office as well. So the other thing I mentioned too earlier with the new House bill that's been introduced, this is probably going to have a major effect if it is approved on our ephemeral stream features. So if this is something that you'd like to learn more about, then I encourage you to keep up to date on it, write to your local representative if it's something you oppose. I try to stay pretty neutral on this subject matter. So if not, just I advise everyone to just keep up to date on any changes with regulations, because regardless of if you're for or against these changes, it impacts permitting, and it does impact the timeline of the permitting process as well. So I know that's a lot of information. Hopefully I didn't bore you guys too much with it, but with that, I'll leave it open to any questions that you may have, and hopefully I can answer them.
Thank you, Mary. I think that your last slide there, clear as mud. Yeah, I'm glad you waded through all that for us.
Yeah.
I've looked at the nationwide permits too, and making sense of it, you did a good job, at least for me, to make sense of a lot of that. So do we have any questions? One thing that struck me that I did want to mention was when we do look at that mitigation, generally, like I say, I'm looking at category 1 wetlands usually, if at the best case scenario, and the preferred mitigation is buying the credits in the bank. And I just want to say, when we look at that switch to the stormwater pond, where in place of what was a wetland, and that impact is taken out of our community, our local community. What I see is that impact kind of goes to the MS4s a lot of times, having stable outfalls that, suddenly are becoming taxed because of the additional input from stormwater. these are the kind of issues that get, the cost gets passed on to a municipality or another entity when we do impact those wetlands like that. So looking for those opportunities for green infrastructure, something, again, on my soapbox, I would like to see where Category 1 wetlands were able to be mitigated on site through the application of green infrastructure. You're providing that infiltration and that that desynchronization of the storm events on site by incorporating that stuff into there. But current situation with permitting is not that way. It's there's preferred methods, and mitigation needs to be done a certain way.
I am not seeing anything entering into the chat box here. So I'll throw out there, if anybody wants to unmute themselves, feel free. I mean, if you have questions or just want to chat about, something going on.
It is our roundtable time. Feel free to ask questions. I will give everybody a little bit of time if they feel like they've got anything question-wise. Looks like we're at about 11:25, so.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to add too, it wasn't written on one of my slides, but if anyone is interested in learning more about that House bill that was introduced, it's actually House Bill 175 is the official number of it.
Sounds like crickets out there. I'm gonna get a cricket sound that I can put on these when I ask for comments, just for that reason. Well, I'm going to say thank you, Mark and Mary. Appreciate your time. It was, like I say, a lot of good information. We'll have most of this posted. Yes, Brooke, it's been recorded as well.
Yeah, probably give me about a week and I'll follow up with everybody with the link and certificates. And if you have any questions on anything, just reach out, and we'll maybe give you a copy of presentations as well. They're available. So
we respect your time and your participation. With that, I will say so long until next time, and we hope to see you again. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for the invite.
No problem.